right, well, good morning, everyone. I'm excited that you're here today. I see a couple of familiar names and faces, so I'm glad to have you back. So what we're going to be talking about today is we are going to be talking about the top 10 root causes for participation and completion within the non-traditional pathways and careers. If you don't know me, my name is Meagan Pollock. I am based out of Dallas, Texas, and my company is called Engineer Inclusion. And I work with organizations, schools, and businesses to help them intentionally and systematically engineer equity and inclusion into their organizations. And I've been doing work around non-traditional careers and pathways since 2009. I'm an engineer by training, so this is something that's particularly close to my heart because it's my lived experience, right, as a woman in engineering. And so I'm excited to bring these topics to you today. Our agenda for today, so we're going to go for 55 minutes and really doing a big overview of the top 10 root causes. We'll take a quick 5-minute break just to give you a chance to stretch and make those activity watches happy. And then we'll come back for the second hour and we'll probably wrap up some of the top 10 root causes, and then we'll do a case study discussion. And so depending on how the group shapes up, we may do that in breakout rooms or we may do it all together. Depends on what works best for us today. I dropped the link to the handouts in the chat. You can see the QR code there, but if you have access to a printer, it might be useful to print it, or you can just put it on another screen and kind of flip back and forth to it. But really, you only need it when we get to the case study. So as we sort of set up for today, and we're going to do introductions here in a second, I just want to introduce the idea that, we're going to be talking about 10 root causes for participation, and there are many, and they are all complex and they work together. But what I want us to think about today, especially because this is part of a series, today, we're just going to talk about what are the root causes. We're not exactly in problem solving mode today. When we come together next month, we're going to be talking about how do we do root cause analyses. And then in March, when we're here together, we're going to be talking about strategies. So once we determine what those root causes are, then we can create targeted interventions that support our students. But I always like to start with Stephen Covey's spheres of influence or circles of influence, because particularly when we're talking about inequities, it can become very overwhelming, right? Like there are so many things that are outside of what we can control and outside of what we can influence. And those things matter. But we want to stay focused on those things that we can control and those things that we can influence. And so if you feel yourself sort of like getting lost in the, oh my gosh, it's all the things, try to reel yourself back in, and then we'll get focused on those things that we can control and those things that we can influence. So again, assuming we all know, but just in case. So we're talking today about non-traditional careers and pathways, specifically within career and technical education. And a non-traditional career is anyone in which a single gender represents less than 25% of the total number of workers. That means students, it means workers, right? And so, there are many different kinds of non-traditional careers. So some examples of non-traditional careers for women are auto mechanic, electrician, computer science, law enforcement, HVAC, which is like heating and air conditioning, construction management, fire management, culinary arts, welding, engineering, just to name a few. And then some examples of non-traditional careers for men are massage therapy, nursing, early childhood education, cosmetology, dental hygienist, medical office assistant, and an administrative professional. And so, as you know, every campus and school has their own set of programs and own set of challenges related to these non-traditional careers and pathways. And so to get us primed with another question, I want you to think about, we're just going to get some of those neurons firing this morning. What are barriers to access and success and non-traditional pathways and careers. So think about what are barriers to access and success in non-traditional careers and pathways. What do you think? All right, policies. What else? What are additional barriers to access and success? Family expectations, yeah. Preconceived expectations, limited opportunities, poor guidance from counselors, not pushing the norm, stereotypes. Access, program availability, success could be stigmas, perceptions by students and staff, faculty, yeah. Staff, what else? More barriers to access and success, what comes to mind? Limited staff, right? You know, with all of my clients across the country, this is a bigger issue than it has been in the past because people are getting sick or they're leaving education entirely. So that's creating a whole other layer of challenges. Transportation, yeah. Any other ideas that come to mind? Well, we're going to keep building on these ideas. And so it's certainly clear that many of you are already thinking about these things, and we already recognize so many of these things within our spheres of influence. Now, today, what we're going to be talking about is I'm going to introduce a way of thinking about root causes. Now, I teach root causes in a variety of different ways, have taught them in a variety of different ways over the years. And one of the things that I've noticed is that typically how I've taught it is like, here's a book, a literature review on all of the root causes. And it can get really overwhelming, right? Because I'm trying to dump, entire multiple graduate levels, courses into people's heads in a matter of a few minutes. And that's really hard. So I'm going to introduce a way for us to think about this that can kind of help us sort them out a little bit differently. Because again, the goal is to think about what are the barriers and the root causes to access and success for our students. And so I'll tell you more about this model as we get to it, but this is going to be our roadmap for today. Now, before we dive into that, let's just do a quick brainstorm of like, what is a root cause? What is a root cause? So how would you explain it to a 4-year-old? Now, I like to qualify that because then people don't feel like they have to give like the fancy answer. How would you explain a root cause to a 4-year-old? So let's do another quick poll. Or somebody unmute and tell us. Anybody here have any kids? Any experience explaining root causes to your kids?
I have old kids, but I would just say the reason why something happened, the reason, what caused something to happen. I don't know.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like what causes something to happen? And there could be many root causes, but the true root cause is that sort of first thing, right? It's what's putting things into motion. Good. Yes, so a root cause, it's that core issue. It's the core issue. It's the highest level cause that then sets into motion this whole cause-effect reaction that ultimately leads to the problems. Now, I've got a short little video that we're going to watch, and it talks a little bit about root cause analysis, which we're going to go into next month, but it does give us some insight and another way of thinking about root causes here in this quick little video.
How often do you ask why? And when you do, how often are you satisfied with the first response? If you've ever had a conversation with a young child, do they commonly accept the first response?
Try to leave it. Don't pull it off.
Why?
Because it needs to heal.
Why?
That's your body's way of healing itself.
Why?
Because you're a strong boy.
Why?
And the body is a miracle.
Why?
And resilient.
Why?
Researchers have explored why young children ask so many why questions and conclude that children are motivated by a desire for explanation. Results indicate that when preschoolers ask why questions, they're not merely trying to prolong the conversation. They're trying to get to the bottom of things. When it comes to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we've got to keep asking why. If we don't keep asking why, we won't get to the bottom of things. We need to find the root cause. The root cause is the core issue, the highest level cause that sets in motion the entire cause and effect reaction that ultimately leads to the problem or problems. Too often, we fall flat when we see the symptoms and problems and we just stop there. For example, let's take a look at a tree and consider non-traditional careers and pathways. A non-traditional career is one in which a single gender represents less than 25% of the total number of workers. What we see first are the symptoms like participation, performance, persistence. If we look a little deeper, we can identify some problems like awareness and interest. But the root cause is the why. Why aren't students interested or persisting? Some causes can include culture and climate, access, opportunity, policies, bias, and stereotypes. There are many root causes for inequities in education and in the workforce, and they often work together in complex ways. Until we verify and deeply examine the root causes for our particular population, we won't fully understand why we see the symptoms and problems that we do. So what can you do? Well, first, read the research, understand the root causes. Next, make a hypothesis of which root causes might be at play. And finally, conduct a root cause analysis to identify and verify underlying causes and barriers before you dive in with an intervention. A root cause analysis is a structured process that assists in identifying underlying factors or causes of an adverse event. Understanding the contributing factors or causes of a system failure can help develop actions that sustain the correction. Otherwise, we keep trying things, burning our time, energy, and budgets on solutions that don't address the root cause. So remember, act like a child, and don't stop asking why until you get to the bottom of things. How often?
All right. So how many of you have ever had a conversation with a child that went sort of like that with Pink and her kid in the vehicle? Anyone? I'm sure all of us can relate, whether they are our children, our nieces and nephews. But yeah, so what's so great, I think, about that example, and I never actually finished the film because I saw that example and I was like, that's a perfect way of describing root causes, right? Like the kid was just wanting to know, he was trying to get to the bottom of things. He wanted to know that final answer, the initial cause and effect that set everything into motion. But, when we think about root causes, particularly when we're thinking about participation and completion and concentrators and CTE, as the video showed, we often see the symptoms, we often see the problems, and we kind of stop there because that is, the sort of surface level of things. It's what's most visible. If I think about all the times when I've heard people say, well, the students, they're just not interested, right? But interest is not a root cause. It's a problem. It's a manifestation of something else that's happening, right? And so today we're going to be talking about some of these root causes. Now, as I set up a few minutes ago, I'm giving us a framework for how to look at these top 10 root causes. And the framework that we're going to be using is what's called the 4 I's of oppression framework. And so we're going to watch another little video here in a second that will introduce us to these 4 I's. And that's going to give us a way of understanding and processing and grouping the 10 different root causes that I want us to learn today. And so before we watch the video, let's think a little bit about what is oppression, right? So oppression is by, certainly definition, barriers, right? They are the true barriers that people are facing. And so oppression, it's this combination of prejudice and power, and it creates a system that can discriminate against some groups and it can benefit other groups. So examples of these systems would be racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, classism, ageism or anti-Semitism. Like these are all systems of oppression. And so why they matter is we're going to look at the way in which these sort of systems begin to affect our students and how they become the barriers that they face. And so these systems of oppression, they enable dominant groups to exert control. And sometimes we don't even realize that that control is being exerted if we're from the dominant groups, because it can limit access and rights and, to resources and to career paths, right? And so there are 4 types of oppression: ideological, interpersonal, institutional, and internalized. And so these systems, they overlap and they interact. All right. Now we're going to watch again this cute little video that's going to teach us the 4 I's, and then that's going to give us the way of looking at and understanding the root causes. So have a listen.
Oppression. It's a word that's often used as a blanket term, but there's actually a whole lot more to it. There are 4 interlocking aspects of oppression: ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. And it might seem like a small difference, but it's very important to be able to distinguish between each kind, because understanding oppression is the first step to fighting it. Let's start with the core at the heart of every form of oppression: ideology. Every system of oppression comes from the idea that one group is somehow better than another. Ideological oppression starts when the dominant group associates positive qualities with itself and negative qualities with the marginalized or othered group. Ideological oppression describes the deeply ingrained social root of inequality. It's the larger overarching idea that leads to the isms. For example, the idea that black people are dangerous is ideological racism. The idea that poor people are lazy is ideological classism. Ideological oppression leads to institutional oppression. Institutional oppression is the way that systems and institutions manifest the dominant ideology. Institutions control access, who is able to get to what and how. This includes legal rights, police practice, access to medical care and education, public policy, political power, and media representation. For example, when women make 2/3 of what men make, that's institutional sexism. When a building is constructed without wheelchair ramps, that's institutional ableism. All of this leads to interpersonal oppression. Interpersonal oppression is probably the easiest to recognize because it happens all around us. Interpersonal oppression is the way that people play out discrimination and violence on each other. It can take the form of microaggressions, jokes, stereotypes, and harassment. For example, when a student is bullied for being gay, it's interpersonal homophobia. When a Muslim person is told that they're a terrorist, it's interpersonal Islamophobia. And all those forces, ideological, institutional, and interpersonal, lead to internalized oppression. Internalized oppression is the way that people with marginalized identities internalize narratives of their own inferiority. It's what leads people to feel less than. This is the end goal of oppression. The oppressive party doesn't need to exert force any longer because the marginalized group is enacting oppression on itself to maintain the status quo. It's important to remember that it's never a marginalized person's fault that they feel internalized oppression. It's simply what happens when someone faces negative stereotypes, low expectations, and ongoing discrimination. So, for example, an immigrant feeling embarrassed about having an accent is internalized xenophobia. When a trans woman feels that they can never be a real woman, that's internalized transphobia. So, to review, the 4 I's of oppression are ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. Each of these types are interconnected and completely supported by the others. They can never exist on their own and can even be seen as a cycle. Now that you understand the different kinds of oppression, you're even more equipped to fight it. Don't forget that any effort to dismantle oppression should aim to address it at all 4 of these levels. Thanks for watching.
All right. Okay, so let's dive in and talk a little bit deeper about each of the 4 I's. So as she said in the video, ideological, it's this foundation of the 4 I's. It's the idea that one group is superior to another. And these ideologies can create a dominant narrative about a group and like this us versus them kind of culture. And so examples of this could be that men make better engineers, or that, certain groups of people are better at math, or that low income people aren't hardworking. Like these are ideologies that become really sort of dangerous belief systems, right? And they're rooted in stereotypes and prejudices. So let's talk a little bit about some of these key terms. So again, in your handout, you have all of the key terms that I'm going to be going through today, again, in the order that we're going to talk about them. So stereotypes, they are these widely held but fixed, oversimplified, generalized images or ideas of a particular type of person or thing. And it usually includes some like personality traits or some circumstantial attributes. And these stereotypes, they can become ideological beliefs that are held within one's culture that lead to assumptions about characteristics, behaviors, and social norms. I love the TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie. It's called "The Danger of the Single Story," and the sort of primary quote there is she says that the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue; it's that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And so when we think about perhaps like the archetype of an engineer, of a computer scientist, they again, most of my stories are around that because it's my lived experience. But I think about my dad. My dad's a white guy. He's a computer scientist. He's an engineer. His dad's a white guy, computer scientist and engineer. So they fit some of those stereotypes of like being kind of nerdy and a little bit goofy and dressing kind of funny. At least my granddad really fits that sort of Dilbert kind of character. He still does, and he's 90. He just turned 93. And so it's the problem with these stereotypes. It's not that they're untrue, right? Because they describe my dad and my granddad. It's just that they're incomplete because I don't fit that stereotype, right? And so, we'll talk a little bit later about how stereotypes affect students, but stereotypes are so prevalent in these ideological beliefs. And so the next part of it are prejudices. And so first of all, like we all have prejudice. Like it's part of how your brain works. If you have a brain, you have stereotypes that are stored in your brain, and you have prejudices. And so prejudice, it's a preconceived opinion that's not based on reason or actual experience. And so within the field of social psychology, prejudice refers more specifically to like attitudes and emotional responses towards a group and its members. So I want you to think about for a second, what are some examples of negative stereotypes about non-traditional CTE careers? So again, it's the same Slido, so just, it'll update on your phone or whatever browser you have it open in. List some examples of negative stereotypes about non-traditional CTE careers. So I already gave some examples around like computer science and engineering, that they're all men, that they're kind of nerdy, that they are socially awkward. So we can like take the whole stereotype of the Big Bang Theory, right? Those characters really fit those sort of archetypes of the character. And okay, so that only men weld, right? I've always wanted to learn how to weld. My dad can weld, and my uncle is a welder for the city of Dallas, and he has been for his whole career. That nursing is for women, right? Like it's because, and we could say because nursing is a helping field, because it's it's for caretakers. And so this reduces the field such that people who feel like they don't have or they aren't comfortable demonstrating those kinds of skills don't go into these pathways. What are some other examples? Welding, if we dug a little deeper, could be that welding is really dirty, right? Or the car mechanics, being an auto mechanic is really dirty. Whereas certainly if you got your hands in the oil or you're messing around with the tires, it could be dirty. But a lot of times the cars these days are just computers, so it really kind of flies in the face of old stereotypes of like the sort of greasy auto mechanic, right? What other examples can you think of about non-traditional negative stereotypes around non-traditional careers. Well, whatever the pathways are, if I think based on many of your titles, you're sort of, in these regional kinds of roles, the teachers who teach these are probably really aware of some of the stereotypes and some of the negative things. Other stereotypes could be around income. It could be around the environment, stereotypes around really, certainly gender is a stereotype, but there are other assumptions and career characteristics that can be limiting as well. So let's look at the next level. So the interpersonal level. So ideological, again, these are these stereotypes and beliefs that existed before us, and they will probably exist after us. But the way in which these stereotypes and prejudices manifest in our interactions become these interpersonal level of oppression. So interpersonal interactions, it's how these ideas are played out in our daily interactions, whether intentionally or unintentionally. So this includes implicit bias, micro messages, perpetuating or not perpetuating stereotypes, not recognizing power and privilege, or claiming like a reverse racism or oppression, right? So examples of interpersonal from a sort of generic viewpoint would be like not making sure that spaces are accessible for events, or laughing at jokes that are racist or xenophobic, or getting catcalled on the street, right? Because it's going back to those isms, whether it's sexism, ableism, or racism, like it's connecting back to those kinds of behaviors, right? And so we have three specific things, root causes, that we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about bias, role models and mentors, and feedback and support. And these I'm all tying to how it's between people, how they're interacting, right? So it's between the advisors and the students, it's between the teachers and the students, it's between the department and the students. It's that interpersonal, it's between students and students. It's how those people are reacting and engaging with one another. So again, let's look at a couple of key terms. So bias, it's an expression of prejudice and stereotypes. So that is bias, right? And bias, it's a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another. So usually in a way that's considered unfair. So as a verb, bias causes one to feel or show some kind of inclination or prejudice for or against someone or something, like either in an explicit or an implicit way. And so when I'm using this here in our root causes, so often we're talking about unconscious bias, but truly explicit bias still exists, right? And that can certainly become a barrier for our students. So explicit bias, this refers to attitudes, behaviors, or stereotypes that affect one's understanding, actions, decisions in a conscious manner. Like when you're making a conscious decision against someone, like that's an explicit bias. If you are doing this in an unconscious manner, this is an implicit. So explicit is like it's happening in a conscious way, implicit is unconscious. And so students can experience bias, again, from this interpersonal kind of interactions with advisors, with teachers, whether they're from high school or college. They can affect bias. They can receive bias from coworkers, people in the workforce. They can experience bias in so many different kinds of ways. Bias can also be embedded in the institution, and we'll talk about that later, but it's people who make institutions, okay? And so bias can certainly be something that people experience. And it could be as subtle as a tone. When someone says, you want to be an engineer? Or it could be as explicit as my grandma who said, and I put this in the case study, who said, that's a man's job. Can't you pick something more feminine? Like that's an explicit bias, whereas an implicit bias could be unconscious in sort of the tone of advising, right? Okay, now the next are role models and mentors. One of the most influential root causes for particularly women in STEM pathways, it is role models and mentors, because there are so few people who women can see who look like them in those pathways. It's one of the most significant barriers. And so when we think about how are we providing opportunities for our students to meet diverse people from these fields, in what ways are students engaging in meaningful mentoring relationships that help them understand and see their pathway into a kind of career. So role models and mentors are really, really important. And there are some characteristics of effective role models. And so first is that there needs to be a perceived similarity. And so this could be any kind of dimension of things. If there's a similarity around, it could be gender, it could be, hey, this person's from the same part of the country, same neighborhood I'm from. This person is the same race as me. It could be any kind of perceived similarity, but the most effective role models is that there's some kind of connection, similarity, because you're saying like, well, if they can do it, then I can do it, right? You're getting that kind of connection there. They need to have some credibility, right? They need to have some chops to be able to talk about and encourage other people to see their potential in these pathways. They need to be enthusiastic. I remember years ago, I was hosting a panel on women in engineering or computing or something like that. And one of my colleagues from grad school, I invited her to be on it. She was having a bad day. She was not enthusiastic. She was real grumpy. And I had to pull her aside and I was like, hey, are you okay? Like, I think you're doing more damage than good today. And she's like, yeah, I'm having a bad day. I got to go. Right. Because if we're not enthusiastic, we can actually, do more damage than we hope. And so they've got to be excited about the work that they do. And then the fourth one is that they need to demonstrate competence through effort. And so again, these are some characteristics of effective role models, and we can talk more about this at another date. Now, the next is feedback and support from others. So this root cause is, in what way are you getting response, encouragement from people about your potential pathway? What's the support that people are giving you? And support isn't just, singular in that it's around from your family or from your teachers or school. It's the kind of support that you get in a work environment. What are the things that are set up for you to have some kind of engagement with other people in the workforce? And so, we have a recording of a workshop that I can share with you all after this from a previous workshop done on feedback. And so if you want to learn more about that, then you can watch that talk. But again, feedback and support, we need people to believe in us because that's going to affect our internalized view of ourselves. And we'll see how this all connects in just a little bit. Yeah, so as you can see with this model, the internalized is the center part, and all of these external pieces are influencing our individuals. It's influencing our mindset. It's influencing our self-efficacy and our determination. We're going to talk about that here in a second. But the next piece here that is, again, it's woven into all of these different kinds of things is the institutional. And I've got 5 different root causes connected to institutional. And so institutional oppression, this creates a system of invisible barriers at many times that limit people based on their membership in certain social identity groups. So the barriers, they're only invisible to those seemingly unaffected by it. And so institutional oppression, it occurs when established laws, customs, practices systematically reflect and produce inequities based on one's membership in targeted social identity groups. So if oppressive consequences accrue to institutional laws, customs, or practices, then the institution is oppressive, whether or not the people maintaining those practices have oppressive intentions, right? So if the policies and procedures, the rules and regulations, if the norms that have been built into the institution, if they are set up to benefit one population of students more so than another, then we have institutionalized the bias, discrimination, and prejudice. And so this is an opportunity for us as educators and as people who are trying to understand root causes. What is it that we need to do to look into our institution, into the institution's way of doing things that can help us understand the ways that we may be systematically limiting student access and success into these pathways. And so we've got 5 here. We're going to talk about culture and climate, and we're going to talk about policies and procedures, marketing, intersectionality, and then student voice. These are all key parts of the institution. And so again, ideological is what is sort of grounds the beliefs, and then people engage in ways that enact these ideologies, all of us, intentional or not. And then people create institutions, and then the institutions, they can then reinforce the ideologies, right? So if we have these ideologies that are then set up to make some people more successful, it can intentionally or unintentionally reinforce the idea of some people maintaining this sort of status quo of these ideologies. So let's talk about culture and climate. So culture is, well, so we want to make sure that we have some awareness of the way in which students experience an environment. So when I'm talking about culture and climate, it could be the culture and climate of the classroom. It could be the culture and climate of the department, the school, and certainly the work environment as well. And so we want to be able to kind of have a pulse on these things. So culture, I don't know, where's the word culture? There we go. The word culture, so this implies this integrated pattern of human behavior that includes all of our thoughts, communication, actions, customs, and beliefs, values, and the institutions of racial, ethnic, religious, or social groups. And so culture, you've got like big culture, and then you get small culture, because every classroom creates a culture. And you could have 6 classrooms in a row, 6 classes in a row, and they could all have very different cultures based on the people who make up that space. And also you create a sort of shared norms, whether they are identified and articulated or not, in how you engage. About what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and who gets to act and engage in what different kinds of ways. And so culture, as a big idea, it shapes our beliefs and forms our biases about people based on their age, their gender, their race, their language, their ability or disability, their class, their income level, or other factors without our realization. And so when we have cultures and classrooms and work environments that reinforce this sort of dominant culture of that space, it can actually, again, go back to how people and institutions reinforce ideologies and say, that's just how it is, right? Like, it's normal for some people, but it's very exclusionary for others. Now, climate, organizational climate, is the way that people experience the work environment. So what is it like to work there? How do individuals feel when operating in that culture? How do the classroom conditions, business conditions, management decisions, and the actions of leadership, how do they affect the general mood? So when you consider the sort of collective experience of all the talent in your organization, or all the great minds in the classrooms, you're evaluating climate. I recently got to deliver a TED Talk, and if you haven't seen it, I'll drop a link of it in the chat here. In my TED Talk, I talk about culture and climate and belonging. The talk is called How to Become an Inclusive Leader. But I share some of my journey and my experience as a woman and in certainly a non-traditional field. But I do talk a lot about how the climate affected me and then how we can affect the climate around us. So I encourage you to take a look at that because it just came out a little over a month ago. I'm really excited about it. Okay, so the next thing to think about is, well, again, tying back to culture and climate here is, in my TED Talk, I talk a lot about belonging. So belonging and feeling valued are fundamental human needs. So even, before self-actualization and self-esteem and all these things, when we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, belonging and feeling valued, it's after like safety and security, but before self-actualization. So it's in the middle of our hierarchy of needs. And how we feel like we belong, the degree to which we feel valued and included, is really important to our success in a pathway. And so if men don't feel comfortable in nursing, if women don't feel comfortable, if they don't feel like they belong in welding, it's going to be a problem. And it's not a function of like, I am determined to fit in, I belong here. It's not that statement of belonging. It's that question of like, do I fit in here? Do I belong? And what is the cost to me of staying in this? And so, when we look at, I've got half dozen books on my shelf that talk about why women leave the sciences. And so much of it is this sort of belief of like not being in an environment that's made for them, that they get tired and exhausted of fighting and being in a place that's not designed for them to belong. I posted on my website a quote from a colleague the other day, and let me see if I can pull it up. He had watched my TED Talk, and he emailed me and said that, it made him think, and that's great. Like, that's the entire point. Let me drop this over here. So he said, I worked in a male-dominated engineering industry in oil and gas. We had female engineers all the way back to the 80s. I never saw them treated differently, but I never thought about how they might feel in that environment. And so this is something that we have to think about. Even though we don't see people being treated differently, we have to begin to think about how people might feel. And so you can read more about this. I wrote a whole blog post on it, but to learn more about sort of what this really means for us. Here, let's see if I can pull it up. I'll drop this link in the chat. There we go. You can read more about that blog. But the sort of key takeaway here is that, once we learn to recognize the inequities and expand our consciousness, we can take some action to do something. And that pattern is what changes environments and outcomes for everyone. All right. So the next are thinking about how our institutions set up policies and procedures. So when we talk about policies and procedures, we're talking about scheduling, we're talking about scholarships, we're talking about the kinds of fees around books and devices, we're talking about, it could be anything as sort of dress code, it could be the way in which we are collecting data and analyzing data. If we're not analyzing data that's disaggregated by at least gender and race, then we don't fully understand the experiences of our students. And that goes into intersectionality, which we'll talk about after the break. But policies and procedures can be tremendous barriers to what students face. And these vary across all different institutions. The next one is marketing messaging. And so, when we talk about marketing, it's not just the flyers that you're creating, it's the websites, it's the language that you use in your course catalogs, it's the imagery that you use in your advertisements and the class posters, it's examples of the curriculum, it's what is it that the teachers are teaching? Is it culturally responsive? And this connects certainly back to the climate, of what students experience as well. and your efforts. How are you actively reaching out to and trying to engage people from non-traditional pathways? So marketing is so often one of the sort of lowest hanging fruits, because you can do a quick image scan of your website to see whose pictures are there. And so that's a kind of a low hanging fruit. Another thing is to do an analysis of your course catalogs to see how can you improve language to be more inclusive and descriptive of the sort of big meaningful message of why should someone do that. Okay, we're gonna take a promised 5-minute break. So we'll come back at 10 o'clock and we'll wrap up the last few root causes, and then we're gonna do the case study together. All right, I'll see you back in 5. All right, so before we move on, I want you to think about what are some examples of limiting non-traditional CTE marketing messages that you've seen. What are some examples of some limiting messaging, whether that's the website, whether that's the course catalog, whether that's the perhaps the language that advisors use, maybe it is posters. Think of some examples that you've seen and maybe that you caught and then you've begun to adapt. So the next topic is intersectionality. Now, this is certainly something that has been in the news a lot, and there's some general just misunderstanding of what it is. But, you know, when we think about intersectionality, we're really talking about all of the different sort of dimensions of who we are or who we could be, right? So based on our race, our gender, our socioeconomic status, our ability or disability, our ethnicity, our citizenship, our sexual orientation, religion, faith, or lack thereof, physical attributes, whether we're tall, short, skinny, big, the traumas that we've experienced in our lives, our age, or the language that we speak. All of these different categorizations, all of these different identities, they are part of who we are and they influence our experiences. And so intersectionality, it's the interconnected nature of these social categorizations and the way in which they can create overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination and advantage. And so, you know, when we think about our experiences, you know, I am a white woman. My experiences are not going to be the same as a Black woman, because when you overlap the systems of oppression that we've talked about, of race and gender, that is going to provide someone who has a different skin color than me a different lived experience, right? When you add in other dimensions of sexuality or ability and disability, all of these things, it can create this sort of overlapping system of the oppressions that we've been talking about. And why intersectionality is important for us to think about as educators is particularly for those of you who are doing your comprehensive local needs assessments and submitting your reports to Perkins. We have to disaggregate the data. It is part of the federal requirement for us to do to receive funding for that. And it allows us to understand the experiences of different groups of students. So if we were to look at a set of data and we just disaggregated by gender, we might be able to see that, okay, well, it looks like the women are doing fine. But when we disaggregate further to understand, well, what perhaps is the experiences of Black women in the program, and we see that they're seeing different outcomes and results, then that drives us to look at the specific root causes that those students are facing, right? And so this is part of an institutional issue when we aren't understanding and digging into the data to understand, again, how are overlapping identities and overlapping systems of oppression affecting our students. Because this is something that's often confused, I have another short little video that I want to show you. And so this will give us a definition of intersectionality. And I want you to think about, in your role as you're watching this, how intersectionality is important from a data analysis standpoint.
Intersectionality. Have you heard this word before? Even if you have, you might not know what it means. Let's take a look at it. The first part's easy enough. Intersection, a place where things come together. Intersectionality refers to the reality that we all have multiple identities that intersect to make us who we are. It also gives us a way to talk about oppressions and privileges that overlap and reinforce each other. This term dates back to the 1980s and legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. She noticed that we didn't have an effective way to talk about how the experiences of Black women are different from the experiences of Black men and of white women. How? Black women endure both gender discrimination and racial discrimination. Over the last 30 years, scholars, educators, and activists have expanded the use of the word intersectionality to talk about identities beyond race and gender. Let's look at a few examples. Jerry has a disability, and his family lives below the poverty line. He is the oldest of 10, which requires him to do a lot of caregiving, and sometimes keeps him out of school. No one in the school counseling office has talked to Jerry or his parents about his plans for after graduation. He has applied for several jobs, but never gets called back. Fatima is Muslim and recently came to the United States from Somalia. She finds that many people at her school make assumptions about her values and abilities before they speak to her. Many of her classmates think she shouldn't be at their school at all. Greta comes from an affluent family. Both her parents and grandparents went to college, and her father owns a successful business. She doesn't think about her identity very often, but she does think of herself as someone who will go to college and get a good job once she graduates. Think about Greta's situation as opposed to Fatima's or Jerry's. Fatima and Jerry are members of marginalized groups. They don't get to choose whether or not to think about their identities. Greta, on the other hand, can ignore intersectionality if she wants to. Life isn't the same for everyone, even for people who share identity characteristics. By adopting an intersectional lens, we have a better opportunity to understand why and to change the institutions that help and harm us based on who we are. Want to learn more? Read our story, Teaching at the Intersections, in the summer 2016 issue of Teaching Tolerance magazine.
So any ideas around why intersectionality is so critical for how we look at and understand our data and the student experience? Anybody have an example? Maybe you want to any examples of how when you looked at the data, you had an increased understanding. When you looked at disaggregated data, it gave you better visibility to understanding the experiences of traditionally marginalized and excluded students. Any ideas? All right, well, you can keep thinking about it. If you want to add, just chime in and we'll
I'll say something, Megan.
Great. Thanks, Monica.
Sometimes, I mean, when the data is black and white right in front of your face, it's very hard to ignore, because sometimes, you can say, oh, people just say that, or, they say that, but that's not a real thing. So when you have the data in front of you, you can't ignore it.
Exactly. Yeah, this is a big part of the work around, what we hope happens with the comprehensive local needs assessments and things like that, is to really challenge people to get your data in a way to look at it and see, oh my, wow, we really do have so many opportunities for improving student experience. And again, if we don't disaggregate by multiple special populations, then we can't understand their experiences. And that leads nicely into the next root cause, which is student voice. And so student voice is the degree to which students have a say in the educational system, the ways in which we are asking them and hearing from them, so that their opinions, their ideas, their voices, and their experiences contribute to what we're doing. It's, if you think about, say that you're going to hire a contractor to redo your bathroom, and you go out of town and then you come back and the bathroom's done. But yet they skipped a few steps. They forgot to ask you anything. They didn't ask you what kind of colors you like. They didn't ask you what kind of tile you wanted. They just built the bathroom how they liked it and how they thought it would work. They, ripped out your bathtub, but you love taking baths. But now you've got this shower. This is how our education system is, right? We have people who just kind of come and tear things out and build things, but yet we don't take enough time to stop and ask students what it is that they need. What would they benefit from? How do they think things should be crafted? So as an engineer, I think about this a lot because it's user-centered design. How am I asking the right questions to get the information I need to create a product, to create a service, to create a resource that's going to answer that need? And certainly, yes, it takes a little bit more time to do that, but the end result is always better because you're using extra information that's available to you. And so when we don't engage our students in the process of building programs, of improving programs, or getting their feedback on their experience in a program, we're missing a tremendous opportunity to engage them and their brilliant minds to improve things as well. So think about, in what ways might students' voices positively influence non-traditional CTE programs and pathways? In what ways, if we were to engage students and their opinions and their ideas and their feedback, how might that positively influence non-traditional CTE programs and pathways? What ideas come to mind? It could certainly increase engagement and participation. You're already talking with students to see why they aren't choosing certain pathways. Yes, that's what we need to know. Why aren't they choosing it? That's a very key thing to understanding root causes. So you're doing that work. That's great. Increase participation by offering what the students want. Yeah. And it doesn't mean we have to reinvent the wheel. It just means that we get to have their input to inform the way that we teach, such that it's going to better serve them, right? Yeah. Another strategy is, when we talk about and how we teach, the ways in which we have student voice and student agency in the classroom, right? How are professors and teachers allowing students to have some choice? That's a key, foundational part of motivation is choice. And so in what ways are our assignments and activities allowing students to have some creativity and choice in what it is that they're doing? All right, well done, thanks. Right, so that brings us to the centerpiece of this. This is the internalized piece. So as we learned in the video, oppression always begins from the outside of an oppressed group. But by the time it gets internalized, that external oppression, it need hardly be felt for the damage to be done. And so if people from the oppressed group feel badly about themselves, and because of the nature of the system, don't have the power to direct those feelings back towards the dominant group without receiving more blows, then there are only two places to dump those feelings: on oneself and on people in the same group. And so internalized oppression, it includes things like feelings of self-hate, believing negative messages, powerlessness, or despair. And so the way that I'm using the root cause for this one, I'm calling it self-determination, but I'm using it to include some other key social learning theories. So if we first look at self-determination, this is simply each person's ability to make choices and manage their own life. But what we don't always realize is that our ability to make choices and manage our own life can often be influenced by so many things, and we don't even recognize the influence of those voices, of those messages. So we could be making a choice that we feel is 100% our choice, but we haven't recognized the unconscious ways that all of these systems of oppression had changed our mind about those things because we've internalized some of those ideologies. One of the ways that manifests is through self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is the belief one has in their ability to accomplish a task. Self-efficacy is one of the most predominant, again, root causes when it comes to understanding inequities in CTE and STEM, because it's this sort of manifestation of all of these other things. And it affects how you think because it answers that question, can I do this? Should I do this? Do I want to do this? Like, is this for me? Can I do it? And so again, it's that manifestation, that big question, can I do this? And then mindset, again, connecting all of these things, that is a self-perception that people have about themselves, which affects how you approach tasks. And so the question that our brain asks here is, well, can I improve with effort? And again, our self-determination, our self-efficacy, our mindsets, all affected by all of the interpersonal, institutional, and ideological things that are happening around us. And so mindset, if you're not familiar with that, there's, from Carol Dweck out of Stanford, you've got a fixed mindset. So that is a belief that your intelligence, your ability, your personality, they're static and nothing can be done to change it. Whereas a growth mindset, that's a belief that your intelligence, your ability, and personality, they can be developed and they can change or improve with effort. Now, the next theory that connects with self-determination is stereotype threat. So stereotype threat is this idea that when you're in a situation or when you're doing something in which a negative stereotype about one's group applies. So if I'm in the little cartoon strip here is of a woman in an engineering classroom, and she says, she's sitting here in the middle and she's kind of like a little nervous. And she's like, wait a minute, I am the only female in this class. The next box says, it's okay, no pressure, just be yourself. No pressure at all. I'm just. And then the next box is the two guys are looking at her. She's like, I'm only representing all of mankind. Ah. And then the last one, she puts her head down on her desk and she thinks engineering 1, womankind 0. And then the guys have psycho and bits in their little thought bubbles. Like, this is how stereotype threat manifests in our brain. And so it's this prompt of like, I can't fail or mess up because I might validate the stereotype that women don't become engineers or that women don't make great engineers. And why stereotype threat is important is because so often this is unconsciously happening in our brain and it literally clogs our cognitive bandwidth. And so it's this unconscious thing that so often happens and it reduces our performance. It reduces our capacity to engage because we've got this whole narrative going on in our head that says, I represent somehow all women. The actor that just passed away, I just forgot his name. The Black actor that just passed away this week. I saw a quote from him that said, let's see. Oh, here it is. Sidney Poitier. He said, I was the only Black person on the set. It was unusual for me to be in a circumstance in which every move I made was tantamount to representation of 18 million people. And so this is a stereotype threat, right? Like, he lived in a space of every move he made somehow represented all Black people. And so this is a lot of pressure and it can affect people, whether we're talking about Black men in acting or women in engineering or men in nursing or anything like that. So stereotype threat, again, it's that external force affecting our mindset. Okay, so now we've been through all 10 root causes and I've given you a little bit of an overview of each of those. What we're going to do now is do a really simple case study. Now, if you open up your PDF, maybe here it is. The case study is on page 9, and the questions that we're going to ask together are group 10. So typically with my BIPSI group, we don't like breakout rooms. How are we feeling about breakout rooms today? Are we wanting to stay together? are you all in a place where I can put you in breakout rooms and you can have a conversation about this? That would be the best learning opportunity, but I want to do what's best for you. Stay together. Okay. All right, so what I'm going to ask is for you to read the case study. I'll put it up on the screen just in case you're having trouble opening it. And so have a read. And I guess I can read it. Okay. Let me give you a minute and then I'll go over it. So give it a skim first. All right, hopefully you've had a chance to read it. Charmaine, I see your comment in the chat. Tell me a little bit about your college experience. Let's put some meat on this case study. Do you want to share some more about your college experience, if you're willing?
Yeah, that's fine. In high school, I was known as the smart Black girl in a high school that was predominantly rich, wealthy, white kids. Then I went to college, which I'm from Kentucky. So I went to the University of Kentucky and I was majoring in electrical engineering and computer science. And the first day I walked into my engineering course, I was the only minority, period. So I was the only female and I was the only person of color. And whenever we would have to do projects or whatever, it was hard for me to find partners or a group, or even when we would have a group, it was hard to make my voice known. Even the professor, you could tell, would look down on me. And he finally paid attention to me because we had a catapult competition. And I was talking about how the degree needed to be around 45 degrees for it to be successful. And because I said that, all of a sudden now I was like, oh, maybe she knows what she's doing. But I was so turned off by that experience that I decided, you know what, even though I love math and science and all that kind of stuff, I don't want to deal with this the rest of my life. So I switched over and became a math teacher. So, yeah.
Well, Charmaine, thank you for telling us, sharing your story. And I'm sorry you experienced that. And, you're not alone. I often share a story of the master's program I was in. Actually, it was both my undergrad and master's. It was like a bridge program. And this is a story around the importance of intersectionality and why we need to look at that data. And so the program I was in was for women at Texas Women's University to study computer science or math. And then you went on to get a master's in electrical engineering from Texas Tech, which, is in West Texas and Lubbock. And what is interesting and sad is that of the dozen of us women that, were in that program, the 4 Black women that were in the program, all of them brilliant, not one of them graduated from the master's program. They've all gone on to get PhDs and other things, and they've had, brilliant, wonderful careers, but they didn't finish at Texas Tech. And the reason is because of intersectionality. So Texas Tech, they had taken really particular effort to understand the experiences of women. And when you think about the environment of West Texas, which is, very white, and when we think about how do we improve equity, which is giving people what they need to be successful, they needed to understand what is it that those 4 Black women needed to be successful. It's not because they weren't smart enough or good enough. It's that there was something around the culture, the climate, the environment. There were other tools and resources and community features that they needed that the school wasn't providing or hearing or listening to, such that they could support them, right? And if we don't disaggregate our data by gender and race to understand, they could look and say, our participation and completion rate's pretty good. But again, that's why we have to look at those overlapping systems, because that is going to give us that visibility into our student experience. And so, like Charmaine talked about, she was in an environment where she was one of the only Black women, and that undoubtedly affects her experience in that space. Thank you for sharing that. So let's think now about what root causes, get back to my slides here. When we look through the case study, what are some of the root causes that you identify? What Emma experienced, what are some of the root causes that you see? So the root causes are listed on page 7. So you got stereotypes and prejudice, bias, role models and mentors, feedback and support, culture and climate, policies and procedures, marketing, intersectionality, student voice, self-determination. What are some of the barriers, the root causes that you're seeing in this? So we've got culture and climate, somebody shared. Yeah, so the culture and climate is her experience in the classroom of like, I don't feel like I belong here. Like the guys don't want to work with me. It's how she experiences that space. What are some other things that you see? What about the paragraph around with her teachers, advisors, with her family? What about some of those interpersonal things? What's happening between her and other people? What are some of the root causes? Is she experiencing any bias, any feedback, support? Lots of role models, not enough role models. Yeah, so she has feedback and support that's both positive and negative. So her teacher encourages her to consider the computing pathways. Her brother and dad pick on her and tease her. Her grandma straight up says, and like I said earlier, like my grandma like legit said that to me a long time ago when I was in high school and picking engineering. Like that is explicit bias. And that's rooted in very deep ideologies. She talks about how she didn't have any role models or mentors. She also talked about she met with the advisor, right? And the advisor encouraged her to pick general studies. What could that advisor have done differently? How, again, we don't know that much about their interaction, but how could the advising have gone differently for Emma when she was picking a path, when she was picking a course, when she was leaving the pathway or not going to register again? What comes to mind?
The advisor could have maybe suggested a mentor or somehow like get her maybe like some experience to where she can work in the pathway alongside of her coursework.
Yeah. Yeah, great idea. So let's talk about institutional. So institutional, we've got, let me go to the list here. Where's my slide? So here's our list here. So somebody already shared culture and climate. So that's how she experienced the space. Policies and procedures. Do you see any mention of policies and procedures that affected her in this case study. So she mentioned scheduling, right? So she needed to work during the day, but many of the computer classes were not at night. And so that was a limiting factor for her. Certainly, a policy and procedure could be embedded in the advising process, right? So if the protocol is to just put students in that general pathway, rather than, providing some other scaffolding for them to be successful, that can become an institutional issue. Policies and procedures can also be, how is that student engaged with when she leaves the pathway? How are we following up with her? How are we understanding, what happened, what could have gone better? How do we keep her in that pathway? She talks a little bit about the sort of messaging of things. I think because she mentions the examples in the classroom. So she talks about, let's see. She said that the curriculum was engaging, but she noticed that all of the videos and stories were of more men. And so again, that awareness was like, oh, well, again, I'm not seeing myself in the classroom either, We talked about intersectionality. That doesn't play to, certainly she, as a Hispanic woman, she is going to experience overlapping systems of oppression here. Because that is her lived experience, and we need to understand that. And student voice, right? So the student went to the teacher, the student has gone to advising. How are we hearing her? Because so often what happens in our policies are like, the student says, I'm not interested. The student says, I'm going to finish the semester, not register again. And we're like, okay. But when it comes to increasing the participation of students in these non-traditional pathways and careers, we have to dig a little deeper, right? We've got to understand those root causes. How do we improve the student experience? How do we provide training for the teachers so that they can have a better influence and control over the culture, of the classroom environment? So they have better strategies for teaching. So we have to understand the student experience so that we can better inform the learning environments. And then finally, internalized for self-determination. Let's see, no more answers there. So self-determination, she lacks self-efficacy. She's like, nah, not for me anymore. So she determines that based on these ideologies of it's not for me, girls like me don't do this, I'm going to go pick something else that's more appropriate, someplace where I feel like I belong to a greater degree. What are some other thoughts and observations about the case study? My next question is, in what ways do the root causes overlap and intersect? In what way do you notice in this case study that the root causes overlap and intersect to affect her experience? Was it one thing? Was it just one thing? Can we just pair up with a mentor and the problem solved? Maybe, maybe not, right? Like we still need to address the culture and the climate. Monica, do you have an idea?
I was just going to say no, but I notice a lot, like mentors are so important because, someone to help you look at the whole picture other than yourself. I feel like maybe a mentor can solve some of these issues, not all of them, of course, but.
Yeah. I mean, so mentoring is certainly useful. And I see a lot of mentor programs come through in these kinds of solutions. I'm a mentor in several programs for students, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, right? Like I can only ask a student to meet with me so many times and they don't, right? So the school might think, oh, we've paired them up with mentors, but if I don't ever get to meet with the student, or if the student meets with me and they're like, this is not really like a good connection, there has to be some kind of infrastructure to find someone that you do connect with, right? And again, it's a part of this. And, certainly sometimes we're blessed with remarkable mentors and advocates. I mentioned that Alice, she's dropped off now. She's been a great advocate for me. I think about my greatest mentor in life, Tegwin Pulley. She's been my mentor since I was about 18. And so for over half my life, she has just poured her knowledge and wisdom and, championed me. And that's a real gift. And not everyone gets that. And her mentorship as a retired senior vice president of Texas Instruments has been a tremendous investment in my life, right? That's really changed my trajectory. So if we are able to help students find those connections, then that's wonderful. But aside from mentors, also having role models. So role models sometimes are less of intense relationships, like less intentional relationships, perhaps, but it gives students a person to see, okay, well, they did it, I can do it, and having lots of those kinds of connections. When it really comes back to this student's experience, Emma, I really think, so much, there's a great opportunity for the, let me move this over here, for the teacher to receive some training on how could he create a more inclusive environment for his students. If and again, even there, I just gendered the teacher as a male. Look at me, see, bias, it all happens to us, and I'm a computer scientist, right? So if we can help the teacher to develop some training, some skills, then that's going to be really potentially valuable, so that they can be more thoughtful to the learning environments that they create as well. So it's not always a one-bit solution. We need to figure out what are the root causes, how, and this is a study of Emma, right? We want to, in your roles, you need to have a sort of aggregate understanding of student experience and how do we improve that. And so when we come back next time in a month, we're going to talk about root cause analysis. And so that means, like, how do we start to think about some of the root causes that are in play and determine what it is. And then the third time that we come together, we'll talk about strategies specific to those. So my last question for the case study was, how do the root causes affect Emma's participation and completion? So we see that she left, right? She had enough to get her in the door, enough positive things, but not enough to help her stay. And so when we again begin to look at the data on an aggregate, when we think about ways that we could survey our students to have better understandings, and some of you already talked about that you're already surveying students when, around their program choice, that's really powerful data. How can we do that in a way that gives us a disaggregated understanding and view of the student perceptions and their choice? All right. So what we've wrapped up the case study here. Let's see. Any questions? Looks like these are just answers. Okay. I have curated on my website at nontraditional.careers a ton of resources specifically around non-traditional careers and pathways. You can create custom posters and you should be able to download those for free. Or you can order print copies as well. I've got videos with interviews with people, so there's a lot of great resources here for you to check out. I can give you a quick tour guide of that. I want to give you a chance to reflect today. thinking back to our agenda and what we've talked about, what are 3 things that you've learned? And if you've got your packet open, this page is, there's a reflection page on the very end. So on page 13, you can use that to type in what I'm prompting you here. So what are 3 things that you learned today? Just take a note to reflect. What are 2 things that you will do differently? And what's an action item that you're jotting down to think about? What's an action item? All right. Pay more attention to policies and procedures in the programs, Perkins funding, especially advising, talk with counselors. I lost my spot. Discuss with counselors their ideas of why low non-grade numbers and allied health pathways, review the materials and share with team. Look for institutionalized stumbling blocks to our programs, talk with counselors about why they have low non-trad numbers in allied health. Pay more, I already read that one. My job is to read grants for Perkins, but maybe I could help regions recognize root causes. Excellent. All right. Oh, thank you. Thank you all so much for contributing your action items here. I appreciate it. All right. February 9th, we'll be back together. We're going to talk about root cause analysis for non-traditional CTE pathways. And so what we'll be doing then is that we'll look at some strategies for how to determine the root cause. We'll look at examples of how to engage in some fishbone analyses. How do we do some action research to understand the questions? How do we kind of create some surveys and things like that? And then in March, we will talk specifically about those best practices for recruiting students into non-traditional STEM and CTE programs and pathways. All right. Martha, Josh, Jeff, Denisha, Charmaine, thank you. And Monica, sorry, thank you so much for coming today. Thanks for your contributions. And I hope that you're taking something valuable away from this.